Hello, I'm Heather Jo Flores, and today we are talking about social permaculture. Now, this video is specifically tailored for students in my online permaculture design course, but I am making it available to the public. Forgive me if I speak in somewhat advanced terms, assuming that you have some experience with permaculture and that you're not brand new. If you are brand new, of course, we do have a free beginner program, and let me know if you want to jump in. There's lots of amazing resources available for you. However, let's move forward. In this video, my goal is to introduce you to the ideas of social permaculture, convince you that it's worth studying and applying, even though it feels intangible sometimes, and give some examples of how you can make it more tangible in your actual design project that you're doing as a student in permaculture, or in all of your design projects that you will do moving forward in your life as a permaculture designer. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right, part one, what is social permaculture? There's a lot of definitions, probably as many specific definitions for social permaculture as there are permaculture practitioners. How I define it is making sure that the people and the variables that go along with the people in your design and that are impacted by your design are included or intentionally excluded depending what you decide. So just like all of the other elements like the soil and the water and the flows and the sectors and the zones, and you're thinking about the mosquitoes and you're thinking about the worms and you're thinking about the climate. So now is the time to bring in really seriously thinking about the people other than yourself who are integrated in the design. Now, of course, this emotional permaculture or personal permaculture or zone zero or whatever you want to call it is part of social permaculture, intersocial, interpersonal. It's all connected, of course, just like the rest of the design is, just like your garden is connected to social permaculture. And we're going to get to that. But first, I just want to revisit our definition of whole systems design and acknowledge that that obviously should include the people who actually live there. And we've talked about making the home a habitat and considering the built environment in your microclimates and in your zones and your sectors and making design decisions based on how adeptly you can turn your home into an ecological habitat for yourself and the other species. And that also has everything to do with the social systems in the environment. If your social systems are dysfunctional, if you're having a lot of interpersonal conflict, it's going to make it really hard to keep that garden going. So this is what social permaculture is, and this is also why we need to learn it. So at the very beginning of our program and in my beginner permaculture courses, I talk about the ethics of permaculture: care for the earth, care for people. So there's social permaculture there, but also that third ethic, which I define as mutual aid and paying forward the abundance that you reap, sharing that for the benefit of others, for the benefit of families other than your own, for the benefit of species other than your own. So that third ethic, sort of, if we're going to call ourselves permaculture designers, then there's an imperative there to embrace social systems design as part of the big picture. And, sometimes I see courses advertised that are like, oh, we'll teach you how to build a sustainable homestead with no theory, no politics, you don't need any interpersonal skills. We're just going to teach you how to garden and can food, and you can have a sustainable homestead. And to which I say, yes, those are amazing skills that we all need to have, but sustainable homestead they do not make, because you can't do it all by yourself. You have to be able to interact with the neighbors and interact with your community in a way that is functional and sustainable. Otherwise, it leads to the things that we see widespread in the world today, such as violence and poverty and exploitation. So without going too far down that road, let's think about the positive stuff and move forward into what social permaculture really can do and how it shows up. So let's jump into a quick overview of the general topics that you learn when you're studying a permaculture design course and how the social layer is a part of that, because I feel like it's a very common misconception or a common pattern in permaculture students that they see the social layer as something that you add later. It's like it's an afterthought or it's a footnote, and they design the garden and they're like, oh, this is the people part. But really it's part of it the whole time. It's completely integrated. So your soil, for example, if your soil on site is going to get ruined, it very much might likely be because of a person who made an error, who didn't understand what was happening with the soil. Right? And also, if it's going to get improved, it's going to take a lot of physical labor from the people there on an ongoing basis. So you'll have to coordinate, you'll have to have a plan, you'll have to be able to communicate about that. Ditto for the water. The amount of water that you consume in your household is going to have everything to do with how well you can communicate with each other. Does it not? Unless you're all by yourself, in which case you hopefully won't consume very much water, and maybe you'll end up having surplus water that you can share with the neighbors who you will then need to communicate with. So you get where I'm going here. It's integrated deeply in every layer. There is no separation. Earthworks, plants in some ways, we go to the garden to kind of get away from people sometimes, but also we grow flowers to show our love for the people. The garden is so much a love language of humanity for each other. So I think that when we embrace the garden as a place to get away from people and also a place to find people and a place to become our best person, then it just gets that much deeper, right? It makes it feel that much more possible to be able to attain this eco-sustainable fantasy that we're carrying. Even the microclimates are going to be profoundly affected by the movement of the humans on site, just like they are by the other animals on site. When you're mapping your zones and sectors, those have everything to do. Zones especially have everything to do with your human behavior. They are all about your human behaviors. But the sectors also, the human reactions. Some people are more sensitive to noise than others. So your stakeholders' personal feelings are going to have a lot to do with how you interpret your sectors, especially if you're working on a home scale site, a smaller site like most of us, which is going to be urban or suburban, and you don't have tons of room for everyone to have their own private island. So, and then the built environment, of course, and ecological technology, these layers of your permaculture design project are completely about our human interaction with the space and the things that we need as humans in order to survive, such as shelter and food and heat and privacy. So this is why we cannot separate the study of social permaculture from the study of just ecological landscape design, because if we're going to call it ecological, then we have to include the whole system. And if we're going to predict potential future problems and forecast potential future benefits, then obviously we're including the humans, the human factors in that process. So it's sort of a lot of words to say. There's no escaping this, and that's why we study it. All permaculture is social permaculture, I like to say, and also all permaculture is placemaking, and we'll get to that in a moment. And there's going to be some links to some other classes that I've offered and some other things that I've written on these topics, and also some other things that some other people have written on these topics, because I am in no way the end-all be-all expert in social permaculture. And if anything, I'm just here to sort of get you turned on to the topic and then convince you to do some further research as suits you, as makes sense for your environment. If you work alone and you do happen to live on top of a mountain, then it's not going to be as relevant, is it? As if you live in a big city and you're surrounded by people, or you have a big family, or you want to run a community program. Of course, it's still going to be somewhat relevant, but it's going to make a difference depending on the context in which you're working. So I don't want to make any assumptions about that. I just want to present some options for you and tell you my perspective on it. So moving on, I mentioned a little while ago that the social aspect has a lot to do with our site selection. It's why we stay in a place, and a lot of times it's why we leave. It's pretty unusual for someone to choose their permaculture design homestead site based entirely on climate, microclimate, exposure, etc. It often has, of course, a lot to do with how much money you have, but it has a lot to do with where you're from and who you know there and or who you want to know. And it also has a lot to do with who you want to be. Who are you in that space? What are you and your family going to use that space for? And that is obviously distinctly social. Are you going to use it as a home base to get back and forth to your job in Seattle? Are you going to use it to manifest your vision of being a seed farmer and grow organic seeds of hundreds of species of plants? Are you going to use it to write your novel? Are you going to use it to raise and educate your children? And that is going to have everything to do with how you design the space, right? So the other side of that coin is within each and every one of those relationships is the potential for conflict. And we see it again and again in our own relationships. You cannot avoid some level of conflict unless you're just dead inside, right? But we also see it on a larger scale in these permaculture communities. It's funny because the social part of it kind of should be the easy part, because we do have control over our behavior. We have so much control over our behavior than we do over things like how pure is the water in our watershed, or the climate. Obviously, we don't have a lot of control over. Even our own financial situation obviously sometimes feels like we don't have a lot of control over it. And there's so many layers to the ecological side of things and the other sides of this that we only can exert so much control over, and we just do our very best to adapt, right? But the social side of this, our behavior and our relationships with people, we have so much more say over what happens in that environment. And yet, this seems to be the area in which we tend to flounder. So all of the big problems that plague our greater society, such as, abuse and housing issues and homelessness and mental health and addiction, and I mean, there's so much that I could go on and on about. All of those things do still exist in our permaculture communities, and they all exist inside of us. We are all recovering from something, and we are all perpetuating things even without knowing about it. So this isn't about beating yourself up or about being perfect, but this is about looking at your own pain and acknowledging the pain and potential for healing of yourself and everyone around you, and using the permaculture lenses, using the principles, using the design process, using your experiences with the earth as a framework for finding a pathway to do better, because it's just really, really hard to walk this path. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when you sit down and you do the math and you pencil it out, none of us are getting anywhere near being sustainable on the planet. And if we do our best to treat each other with as much kindness and compassion as possible as we travel together on this journey, then that's the only way that we are going to get any closer to this big goal. If we're infighting and picking each other apart and worrying about these nitpicky little details in our interpersonal relationships, then it's hard to imagine how a cohesive movement is ever going to manifest for permaculture, or even just in our own neighborhoods. So it's up to you to figure out what your boundaries are in your design process. If you're just kind of a recluse, antisocial introvert like me, then you design your project, your site selection happens in a more remote setting. Don't go trying to do an urban permaculture project. You won't be happy. You won't have fun. People won't like you. So if you're a super boisterous extrovert who tends to be really good at resolving conflict, or is willing to work really hard and learn, then go out there and do those community projects. Take time to study. Don't just jump right into a leadership role without taking time to study. Each of these principles that we study, I mean, there's this laundry list I gave you. And I know that traditionally a lot of people study this set of 12 principles brought by one particular teacher. And the reason I don't teach those is because, well, first of all, I feel like you've seen them. But second of all, I feel like I don't want you to miss the rest. There are so many. There's no end. There's a limitless amount of lessons that you can learn from nature. And each of those lessons has a physical and scientific truth, and each of them has an attitudinal principle associated with it. Each of them has a philosophical truth, if you will. So, for example, work with nature rather than against it. So we've discussed the ecological aspects of that, but the social aspects of that is like, if somebody it's in their nature to not want to be around a lot of people, they prefer to be in small groups, then it's not really up to us to try to change that nature. It's up to us to design accordingly, if that person is a major stakeholder in our design or in our project. So, the problem is the solution. Same thing. if somebody doesn't like something, then what do they like? What are they good at? Make the least change for the greatest effect. This is one of my favorite permaculture principles. What can you do less of? A lot of times when there's a conflict in a relationship, you really just need a break, right? You don't necessarily need to take it apart and solve it or change anything. People just need some space. So that could be an example of how that is an attitudinal aspect of that principle. I could go on and on about this. And, mistakes are tools for learning. That's one of the really big ones, because we need to, if we're going to evolve as a humanity, we need to become better and better and better every day of our lives at apologizing and at accepting an apology and saying, yeah, it's okay, I'll put it behind me, and just really, letting it go and allowing the friendship to continue or the business relationship to continue. And so I think that there's a lot to be said about integrating that skill into your toolbox as a permaculture designer. And really all of this kind of distills down to one of the very first principles I ever learned, and that's this: designer limits the yield. So your yield of your site is going to be limited by a lot of different factors, but one of the biggest ones, not the only biggest one, not the very biggest one, but one of the biggest factors that is going to limit how much you can get out of your permaculture site, food-wise, energy-wise, all of it, happiness-wise, is you. So the person doing the design, their failure to see new ideas, their failure to be open to change, their resistance to the facts, those are going to limit the system. So become aware, commit to yourself as a lifelong learner and ecological designer to continuously become more and more aware of these patterns and of how you're limiting your yield. And I've talked about this in this Emotional Permaculture course. If you've taken the 3-day Emotional Permaculture mini course that I offer, we talk about how do you limit your yield. And if you haven't taken that, I invite you to do so, because it's an important reflection for all of us. It's such a simple thing. How are you preventing yourself from having more abundance? So let's move on. It's a given that creating a permaculture design is about homes, gardens, and community projects. And it's about making places that nurture the true characters of who we want to be. People who deeply care for the earth and who care for each other and who make our daily choices accordingly. But as we've been discussing, that can be really easy to say and something else altogether to do. In real life, it's all too common for permaculture projects to have alienation problems. And the thing starts out great, but then conflicts come up and the collective tends to flail. So how can we design in a way that doesn't repeat this pattern? Now, my other passion besides permaculture is writing and the craft of storytelling. And I want to share something that I read recently that I find deeply relevant. And I think that one of the reasons that this alienation problem tends to occur is because often these sites are designed with the characterization, the stereotype of permaculture in mind. There's sort of like a checklist that got ticked off, but they weren't necessarily designed in order to embrace the true character of the people that were going to be living there, the actual stakeholders in the design. So there's a writer called Robert McKee, and he wrote a book called Story, and it's a book for screenwriters, and he writes about character versus characterization. And I wanted to read you a passage from that because it's just, I find really, really interesting. So he says, characterization is the sum of all observable qualities of a human being. Everything knowable through careful scrutiny: age and IQ, sex and sexuality, style of speech and gesture, choices of home, car and dress, education and occupation, personality and nervosity, values and attitudes. All aspects of humanity we could know by taking notes on someone day in and day out. The totality of these traits makes each person unique because each of us is a one-of-a-kind combination of genetic givens and accumulated experience, nature and nurture. Right? As humans, we tend to form these assemblages and identities based on our own characterizations of ourselves and others. We have our own backstory. We have our own idea of ourselves as the main character of our lives. And we have our own way of looking at permaculture and related topics as relates to the context of our lives. And then permaculture itself has its own characterization, doesn't it? We tend to characterize permaculture as this thing with specific traits and values. It's organic, it catches water, it composts, it creates microclimates, it keeps chickens. We have this idea in our head, and that's what we try to apply when we do our permaculture design. And of course, a lot of those things do fit in and a lot of those things do make sense often, but sometimes they don't. In permaculture designs, it's very common to see them arranged in a way that accommodates these characterizations of what a permaculture should be, but without enough attention paid to the true character of the stakeholders who live there. So let me continue the quote. This singular assemblage of traits is characterization, but it is not character. True character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, the truer the choice to the character's essential nature. Beneath the surface of characterization, regardless of appearances, who is this person? At the heart of humanity, at the heart of their humanity, what will we find? Are they loving or cruel, generous or selfish, strong or weak, truthful or a liar, courageous or cowardly? The only way to know the truth is to witness this person make choices under pressure, to take one action or another in the pursuit of their desire. As they choose, they are. Don't listen to what people say, pay attention to what they do, right? This is the end of the quote. He says, pressure is essential. Choices made when nothing is at risk mean little. It's like the old saying, it's easy to be a holy man on top of a mountain. So in order for us to be, as a people, as a humanity, to truly thrive and feel safe, we have to know who we are under pressure. We have to know who our loved ones are under pressure. This is part of growing up. It's part of falling in love. It's getting to the true character of a person and being frank and honest about who that really is, and owning our weird habits and owning the nerdy sci-fi that we're into, or the fact that we don't like to eat kale. I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of. And the other side of this is going back to designing for chaos and catastrophe. If we think about designing a system that can withstand under pressure. So we're not just talking about the true character of you and your stakeholders, but we're also talking about the true character of your design. How is it going to withstand pressure? How is it going to withstand climate pressure? How is it going to withstand economic pressure? And how is it going to withstand social pressure? So, and at that point, are you going to flail? Will you break? What decisions will you make when it's time for your true character to stand strong? So I think that's a really relevant metaphor when you're thinking about designing a system that is both ecologically and socially sustainable. And I'd be really interested in hearing what y'all think in the discussions, because this is in a way, as we create our ecological home and garden and habitat, we are writing a story, aren't we? We're writing an autobiography of our own lives. Our gardens are definitely a piece of ourselves, and they're part of our story. So I think that there's something to be learned in the age-old craft of storytelling that is so central to us as a humanity. In summary, if you want to design a system that is both ecologically and socially sustainable, you have to create a space that doesn't just represent a characterization of what a permaculture should look like, but also provide shelter for the true character of who the actual inhabitants deeply are and what they want to do with their time. Not just you and your family, but also the dogs, the insects, the birds, the plants. Learn to recognize the characteristics of these beings, but also learn how they behave under pressure and adjust your design accordingly. So this to me is the essence of what social permaculture is and does. And you'll notice I use the word shelter a few times in this talk because that's what we're designing in essence. A shelter for ourselves, our bodies, our families, our pets, our plants, and a shelter for our ideas, a shelter for our creativity, for us to sleep and rejuvenate, to conduct experiments, to practice and fail, for a place for us to make mistakes and not be ashamed. So this pursuit of permaculture or of sustainability, in some ways, it's like the pursuit of enlightenment. We really aren't going to know in this lifetime whether or not we've gotten there. We just pursue it because it makes sense and because we can't not pursue it. So how is your permaculture design going to help create an abundant container to make that more possible for you, so that when you look all around and you see all these horrible things happening, how will your space help to create a light at the end of the tunnel for yourself and others? Okay, let's come back around to the idea of theory and hubris versus getting out there, getting dirty, and making it happen. And even metaphorically, getting out there in the community and just meeting people and making it happen, making these connections, building your relationships, making everything better. How do you bridge the gap between waxing poetic about this stuff and being like, oh yeah, definitely, this is what I want, and actually seeing those changes occur in real time? And that's when we come back around to this idea of placemaking, and to my assertion that all permaculture is placemaking. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing. We're making a place. We're making a place for ourselves, a place for the mealy bugs, a place for the dogs. I make places for my dogs all the time, little fluffy places for them to hang out in. And that's actually a wonderful example of what placemaking, the definition of it is. You go to a space, you check it out, you think about what's going to happen there, who's going to inhabit that space, and then you design it accordingly. And it can happen on such a small scale, just like a tiny dog bed on the chair, or you can be designing a whole eco-city, right? So place-based design is what this is all about. And placemaking, I like this lens for taking all this stuff that we've been learning, all this crazy permaculture, huge basket full of information, and to try to synthesize it into something that is bite-sized and feels possible. If you think about placemaking as this physical act, because it's fun and it's nice and it makes people happy and it makes people feel good. And, something like putting up a tiny free library. What an amazing radical act is to just give away books. It's so simple. You created a place where people can stop, take a book, leave a book. It's also a spiritual act. One of the things about placemaking is it's where we can connect how we feel with what we do. Whew, that was a lot of words. And now I want to lead you through a little visioning exercise, a very short one. And I just want you to sit back and right now, take a breath. Take another breath. Unclench your jaw, which is probably clenched. Stick your tongue out. Shake your head around. Feel down into your sit bones if you're sitting down, or even if you're standing up, and let go of your butt muscles. And just settle into your body. Close your eyes. Try to find that deep, low, most centered part of your breath. Try to find the part of your breath that comes from the deepest part of your body. And on your next exhale, see if you can let go of all of your preconceived notions about what is possible for humanity today. And then inhale hope. Exhale despair, disappointment, disenchantment, desperation. Inhale a willingness to be surprised by our ability to change. And imagine everyone on the planet has a way to contribute that is distinct and creative and fulfilling for them and the people around them. Imagine a home for yourself and your loved ones that is safe and nurturing and feels like it's perfect for you. Keep your eyes closed and just be in that reality for 3 deep, long, slow breaths. Now open your eyes. Shake it out. Woo! With your hands. And I hope you have a a wonderful day.